There are some basic tips that every quilter needs to know when it comes to sewing blocks together and pieces together to get better accuracy when they're piecing. Some of the things I'm going to talk about are your ruler, using your ruler, good tools you want to use. I'm going to talk about some pins. I'm going to talk about getting a good accurate 1/4 inch seam allowance. I know some people talk about this scant 1/4 inch, but everybody has a different definition of what a scant 1/4 inch is. So it's real difficult to tell you exactly what a scant 1/4 inch is. And I'm going to talk about some tools that I use to get my piecing to be more accurate. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is the use of your ruler. And it's real important to use the lines of your ruler properly. So when you're using your ruler, you always want to include the very thin line that you're cutting, that you're using to measure with. So I would include this line. My fabric would be right up to the edge of that line, and it wouldn't go over that line. It wouldn't be in front of the line. So just be sure you cover that line when you're cutting your strips. The next thing is you want to make sure when you're piecing things that you have an accurate 1/4 inch. Now I talk about an accurate 1/4 inch because that's a mathematical term. A scant 1/4 inch isn't a mathematical term, so it's difficult. Everybody's different definition of a scant 1/4 inch is different. Some people say it's a thread's width, some people say it's 2 threads width, some people say it's a smidge, so we don't know what that means. So I'm going to show you how I get an accurate 1/4 inch on all of my sewing machines, because if you can establish it on all of your sewing machines, you can move back and forth to different sewing machines. The 1/4 inch feet on some sewing machines is different from a 1/4 inch feet on other sewing machines. So even the 1/4 inch foot that you might use might be different. So this way you can set up all of your machines to be the same. The first thing I do is I use my regular sewing foot, which I have on this machine here, and then I move my needle all the way to the right. And I'm going to explain why I do this, and there's a couple reasons why. Okay, so I've moved my needle all the way to the right, and then I take a ruler or a special tool. Now I have a little ruler here myself that's of course got my name on it, but you don't have to use a ruler like this. You can use your regular ruler, and with my ruler, I'm going to put the needle right in this hole, which is at an exact 1/4 inch. Now if you're using a regular ruler, you'll just use that 1/4 inch line to get your needle on top of. But I'm just going to put my needle right in that 1/4 inch hole. I'm going to lower my foot, and then I'm going to set what I call my little shelf, or a fence, as they call it in woodworking. It's called a fence. I'm just going to I use Dr. Scholl's mole foam foot pads, and I cut them into little strips. And I'm just going to take the backing off of it, and I'm going to set it right next to my ruler. If I can get the backing off of it. Okay, there we go. And I'm going to set that just so it hugs that ruler, just like this. Okay, so now I pick my needle up and move my ruler out of the way, and now when I put my foot down, there's a little ledge, a little edge or space between the foot and this little pad that I have here, so that I can see where the edge of my fabric is. If I can see where the edge of my fabric is, then I know I'm going to be at a 1/4 inch every time I sew. So let's sew some strips together. I've got 3 sets of strips here at 2.5 inches, and I'm going to sew them together. And you want to make sure that you line them up nice and even. A lot of times people will bring their blocks to me and ask me, well, why didn't it match? And I'll look on the back and I'll notice that their fabric is not lined up. If you can see one of the fabrics either on top or on the bottom, then your fabric's not lined up. So I always make sure that my fabric is lined up perfectly when I go to sew. And then I'm going to set it in my machine, and I'm going to have it touching that piece of foam. And when it's touching that foam, I know it's going to be at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I'm going to sew, and I do shorten my stitch just a little bit because I like the little tighter stitch, maybe a 2 or a 1.8. And I'm going to sew, and as I'm sewing, I'm going to check underneath to make sure that everything's lined up and I don't have, my fabric hasn't moved on me. So I'm going to continue to sew till I get to the end, making sure that my edges are completely lined up. And once I get to the end, and I'm always kind of guiding the fabric so that it touches that little piece of foam. So you can see here, I have a nice, even 1/4 inch seam allowance. It's even from the top all the way to the bottom. Okay, so now the next step is I want to press it. Now, Ashley talked about setting your seam. So you always want to set it with a hot iron. I don't usually use steam in my iron. I think that steam sometimes distorts your fabric, so I use just a hot iron. And I'm going to finger press it in the direction I want it to go, because when you finger press, you can feel if your seam is laying nice and flat. Okay, if you take it to the iron right now and you don't finger press it first, you might end up with a pleat in there. So now that I've pressed it with my finger, I'm going to go ahead and press it with the iron. Now, when you're pressing it with an iron, make sure that you press it so it's straight. A lot of times when you press long strips, you end up, it gets distorted because it's not straight on your ironing board. So if it looks like this as you're pressing it, it's going to end up being like that. So I want to make sure that it's straight when I press it. And I press it in the direction that my seam is going. I don't iron it back and forth, because that's called ironing. When we quilt, it's called pressing. Okay, so I've pressed it. Okay, now I'm going to sew a third strip on, and then I'm going to measure that center to see if I have a 2-inch strip, 2-inch finished section when I'm done. Okay, so again, I'm going to line my edges up just right, set it under the foot so that it's touching that piece of foam, and then I'm going to sew. I'm going to stop if I see that the fabric edges are coming apart. I might check underneath to make sure the edges are still even. Okay, and then I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to set my seam with hot iron. I'm going to finger press it. Now I'm finger pressing towards the dark, but sometimes you can't always finger press towards the dark. And then I'm going to press it with the iron. Make sure that my strip stays flat and straight. And now I'm going to measure that center section. That center section, since these were 2.5-inch strips, should equal 2 inches. So this will tell me whether I've set my mole foam in the right place. So let me look here, and I'm at exactly 2 inches. So I know my seam is set right, I know my mole foam's in the right place, and I know I'm going to have that perfect 1/4 inch every time I sew. Another thing that's important when sewing is you want to make sure you use a good rotary cutter with a nice sharp blade. You want to loosen that blade just a little bit. If it's too tight, you're going to spend a lot of energy cutting. So you want to loosen it just a little bit. Make sure your wheel runs nice and smooth, and always have a sharp blade. The other thing is pins. You want to make sure you have a nice sharp pin, and I always recommend a pin that's 0.5 millimeters or smaller. So these are 0.4 millimeter pins. They're best for working with batiks because you don't want to make big holes in your batiks. So 0.5 or 0.4, a lot of times you'll buy pins They don't have a label on them. They might not say how big they are. So make sure that it tells you the size. It doesn't make any difference how long they are, but you want to make sure you get a size, the size of the pin is listed on the package. So if you follow all of these tips, you're definitely going to get better results in your quilting. Your blocks are going to fit together better, and you're going to be much happier with the end result.